You can take it away.
All right, that's way too much power, but thank you. All right, everybody can hear. Audio looks like it's working. Video's working. I'll screen share here in just a minute. As introduced, my name's Matt Wagner. Along with my wife, Jerry, we own the Driftless Angler Fly Shop down in the southwest corner of Viroqua, Wisconsin. I'm just going to talk a little bit about what makes the driftless so special and so unique as a fishery, because it really is a different fishery than most anything out there on the planet, quite frankly. So, without any further ado, give me just a second and I'll get the screen share going here. Okay. We should be going here. So if you can't hear it, you can't see, Tyler, shoot me a message and I'll make sure we go back here. But the driftless. So the driftless area is tucked kind of in the northwest portion of the upper Midwest. And again, we're just going to go over what makes this such a cool area and such a unique area. This opening slide is a fairly typical bluff in Wisconsin. When you think of Wisconsin, you don't necessarily think of hills and valleys and things of that nature, but the driftless area is definitely an exception to that. So, what is the driftless area? What does the term driftless mean? Driftless is basically when the glaciers go through an area, plow everything up, flatten it, and deposit stuff that's known as drift. So all the all the stuff that the glaciers leave behind is known as glacial drift. So our area is what's considered the driftless area. As you can see on the slides here, we have the last ice ages. Oops, going back. Sorry about that. The last ice ages, we had the glaciers surround our area. Our area is in the dotted portion there, and they never went through here and plowed everything up. So we have basically untouched bedrock of sandstone and limestone. That's part of the reason our fishery is so unique. So the area itself is about 24,000 square miles. We have the lion's share of it in Wisconsin, but it also touches parts of Minnesota, Iowa, and even in Illinois. So as we can see on a topographic map is this little driftless area that's circled here, that has all those neat little bumps and valleys. Every single one of those valleys actually has a trout stream in it. So geologically unique, as you're traveling from the south or east or west of us, is you get kind of what we refer to as corn desert, very kind of boring flat lands, nothing really to see except for a bunch of cornfields. And all of a sudden, once you hit about Madison, Wisconsin on the east side and start driving through, you're driving through these really cool windy roads and hills and valleys there. Again, just a typical view. What does this mean? So we know that the glaciers never plowed this area up and it left old sandstone and limestone. Who cares? So what? What it means is we have an extremely unique geology here that turns into excellent trout fishing. The water in the driftless is 1/1,000,000th of 1% of the world's fresh water, the way that it sets up. What happens is, because of the geology, we have all these spring creeks. Rain comes in on the top of all the sandstone and limestone, starts to percolate and trickle down in, and comes up as groundwater. Our portion of Wisconsin is actually the worst part in the entire state of Wisconsin for any warm water fishing, because we don't have standing water. We don't have lakes, we don't have swamps, we don't have ponds. It all trickles into the groundwater system and comes out as springs. Those springs themselves are great trout fishery because they maintain a fairly constant flow, stable temperature. Even on a day like today, when it's 20 below with a wind chill here in Wisconsin, we'll actually have some midges hatching and some rising fish. Don't necessarily want to be out fishing in there, but because there's spring creeks coming out between 45 and 55 degrees, all of our creeks maintain a good temperature. As it goes through the limestone and sandstone, it's filtered, and it also gets the correct pH and chemical balance to support aquatic life, aquatic vegetation, amphipods, crustaceans, insects, etc., etc. So all of this stuff together turns into pretty much what you're looking for as an ideal trout fishery. You have good temperature, you have good flow, you have good chemistry to support life. This, as you're fishing in the driftless, every once in a while you'll come across these springs cascading down the side of the hill or trickling down the side of the hill. It's a very common sight on our creeks. So simply, we've got this awesome geology. We've got this really cool place that all of these seeps and all these springs come out, and they support trout fishing. This healthy aquatic life equals an extremely healthy fishery. Now, we've got this awesome geology, we've got this groundwater, we've got the right chemical, we've got the right pH. Another thing that the Driftless has going for it is most of your, quote unquote trout towns, kind of the hubs in the Driftless, all are small farm cities. Here in Viroqua, where our shop's located, we have places to stay, we have places to eat, we have multiple lodging, we have other nightlife activities, et cetera, et cetera. For those who have fished like Fort Smith, Montana, or Navajo Dam out in New Mexico, it's not 5 fly shops and a trailer park and a restaurant that may or may not be open. There's actually stuff to do here within town outside of the fishing. Obviously, the fishing is still kind of the main attraction, but you're not stuck in the middle of nowhere. From you, it's about a 7-hour drive if you are brave and lucky enough to drive through Chicago without traffic. Alternate routes that add a little bit of time on there, but it might be worth not driving through Chicago. Nobody likes Chicago. That's always a hard sell to tell people to come through Chicago. But it's within the realm of possibility of making it a long weekend or a 3 or 4 day trip. It's not a super, super long drive to get up to us from the Indianapolis area. So, our area, just based on the ecology and the riparian zones, is a great fishery, but it always wasn't an awesome trout fishery. When the colonists came and settled the area, they'd farm up on the top of the hills. They'd cut all the trees down, intensively farm on the top of the hills. Rains would come, it would wash all the sand and dirt and silt from those hills down into the creeks. And made the creeks just awful. They weren't trout creeks at that point. You might get a couple of warm water species, a couple of catfish in there. It wasn't what we think of in the Driftless now. It didn't have the type of support that was baked in. Right around the 20s and 30s, the Driftless area started to become a major conservation project. This sign still exists just outside of the little town of Coon Valley. This really is the nation's first watershed, federal watershed project. Back in 1933, local landowners, farmers, federal government, state government all came together and said, hey, we're kind of screwing this area up. What can we do to get this back so farmers don't lose their soil, landowners, houses and barns aren't falling in? How can we make this a bit healthier? As we fast forward into more modern times, because of local conservation efforts from Trout Unlimited, from various fly fishing clubs, from the state, from private landowners, from the county. Again, everybody's getting together and doing a bunch of restoration work on these creeks, and have been since the 60s and 70s, and they continue to this day, where they'll grade the banks to make sure that that soil's not washing into the creeks, stabilize banks, put rocks in. As you can see here, I can't get my highlighter going. Oops, went ahead again. As you can see here, this is a stabilized bank, and something that you'll see quite a bit of are these lunker structures. This rock formation here, there's my pointer. This rock formation here is actually an artificial undercut bank that you see from time to time in the Driftless area. It's slabs of limestone over pallets, basically. We call these brown trout hotels. Current comes in right here, forms a nice bubble line. The fish are hiding underneath these rocks and will come out and grab your fly. Great spot to fish in the Driftless if you can find some of those. But again, this just kind of hammers home the point that what's happening in the Driftless area, because of local conservation groups, because of state conservation groups, the good old days of fishing are right now in the Driftless. I don't think we can really say that anywhere else in North America. This is what fishing was like back in the 70s and 80s out west. There are fewer crowds. These streams are all incredibly healthy. There's tons and tons of water to fish, and it's getting better each year too as more of these conservation efforts improve the fishery. So we have this awesome geology and geography that sets up perfect aquatic life. We have a baked-in conservation ethic in our area where people understand the preservation of these creeks, not just for fishing, but for, again, riparian ecology, for farmland, etc. Plus, we've got a ton of water. Within the county that the fly shop's in, there are about 67 classified trout waters. That's roughly 250 miles of water. There's tons of room to spread out. The common rule of thumb for angler courtesy here, if there's a car at an access point, you drive to the next access point. It's only 3, 4, 5 minutes to hop to the next valley and get onto the next creek. So there's plenty of room to spread out. That's part of the we fish nice in the driftless, is it's less crowds, uncrowded. We don't hop above and high hole people. There's just plenty of room to spread out where you can have a good day in the peak of season and still only see a couple of other anglers on most of our creeks. So this just kind of shows the map. This is the county that the fly shop's in. Right here is the booming metropolis of Viroqua. Viroqua is only a town of 4,500. Again, there are facilities there, but don't expect too much out of it. But all of these little colored lines here, these little squiggles are trout streams. Classifications are a bit old, but yeah, Vernon County is our major county. Richland County to the east southeast, and not pictured on the map, but on the southern side are Crawford County. Those are the 3 major counties that we fish and guide in through the shop. And within those, you are looking at roughly 700 miles of trout water between those 3 counties. So more than you could really fish in an entire lifetime there. The season in Wisconsin, believe it or not, season is open right now. There aren't a lot of people fishing right now because it's bitter cold, but the catch and release season opens the first Saturday in January and runs to the first Saturday in May. That first Saturday in May starts harvest season and goes all the way through October 15th. The state shuts the fishery down in middle of October through that January to protect spawning. Our trout are native brook trout and wild brown trout. They spawn in the fall. They're making sure that anglers aren't inhibiting the spawning. Again, kind of that baked-in conservation effort in the state. Licensed price are listed down below. They do include a trout stamp. Another cool thing about Wisconsin, that $10 trout stamp, all that money is earmarked to go towards trout stream restoration and public land purchases. It's not just lumped into the general fund. So when you buy a trout stamp and a license in Wisconsin, at least a big portion of that money is going right back into the trout fishery. So to add on, we have extremely angler-friendly access laws here in Wisconsin. A lot of people come here and say, hey, this is kind of like Mayberry. It's laid back. It feels, like it used to in terms of fishing. We have a ton of, of public lands and very accessible lands. The law in and of itself, the state of Wisconsin owns the stream bed and the water that flows through it. So unlike some places out west like Colorado, where you can't even put an anchor of a drift boat into the creek, if you have 1 foot in the water and have bought your fishing license, you are on public property anywhere in the state of Wisconsin. The creeks here, being smaller, slow-flowing spring creeks, are easily wadable. Through the private land sections, it's not difficult wading. If you get up to your waist, you found the deepest hole in the creek. So very easy to get around, but we're also lucky enough that the state, the county, and even some handshake agreements with private landowners, there is a boatload of public fishing out here. What the state does is they'll lease conservation easements, which legally are 33 feet from the center line of the creek. What that means is you have basically a rod length on both sides of these creeks in order to walk and fish and move around there. Again, you'll find a bunch of these styles in our area. Farmers don't put step ladders in their barbed wire fences for no reason. Those are usually public access points and well marked. You can't quite see it, but that white sign with green lettering right there that says private land leased for public fishing only. Some of them, they'll have the trout regulations for harvest season, and some of the landowners are nice enough to warn you if and when they put a bull in the pasture. This sign was up for 7 years. There was a bull in there for 2 months. It was one of the best fishing sections because nobody went there. Once they pulled the bull off and the people who lived here, the locals figured out that, hey, the bull's not out there anymore. Nobody that came into the area to fish, this is on one of our most popular creeks, nobody would cross that style to fish because they thought they were going to get chased by a bull, and the fishing was fantastic for a couple of years. The other nice thing, going back to that, saying it feels a bit like Mayberry, is don't be afraid to ask local landowners for permission to access their creeks. The nice thing about our area is within Vernon County, all of the roads follow the creeks. They're in the valleys. All of those roads are also paved because of the dairy industry, so you're not messing with dirt roads, which is kind of nice. But it's very easy to find landowners, if they're working out in the field or just kind of at home type deal. It's never a bad idea to swing in and say, hey, you have a nice looking section of creek. I'm so-and-so from wherever you're at. Would you mind if I fish that property? Even if it's still public property, it's just a great way to continue the angler landowner relations and a good way to get access to some spots that you might not have otherwise. The streams in and of themselves, I kind of touched on this, extremely easy to wade in these creeks. They're very, very shallow, shin deep to thigh deep in most of them, and very slow flowing. Our stream beds themselves are limestone and sandstone, so very easy to walk and wade. You don't have slick rocks, you don't have boulders, there's no hiking in for miles to get to the creeks. You can barely see it, but the road actually is right back here, so you're not traveling far to get to the creeks. Once you do get to the creeks, they're very easy to maneuver around in, and you also have that conservation easement, that rod length of land on the banks on many of these too, that's extremely well marked to be able to get around. So it's not an effort to get to most of the water, not an effort to find a place to fish when you're out here visiting. We like to say it's so easy, even a kid can do it. This is my son. It's a very, very old picture. He's taller and bigger than I am now. It's just kind of frightening. But again, you can see the picture of me here. I'm actually in blue jeans and tennis shoes. There are plenty of spots that you can go and just kind of fish roadside and still be able to have a successful day out there. Most of the streams, for those of you who are familiar with the driftless area or looked it up, those really cool pictures of those big meandering meadow streams, that's the vast majority of our water here. If you've never fished the driftless but have done some high elevation cutthroat fishing out west, similar to those meadows is how most of our water lays out. We do get a handful of creeks that flow up against these giant bluffs. Again, sandstone and limestone bluffs. You'll see some springs kind of trickling down the sides of them. Very, very pretty, very picturesque, and great places to fish in the summertime because they give you a little bit of cooler temperature because of the shading of them. All right, another benefit of our water is, because it's filtered and comes out as springs, is our creeks tend to run extremely clear, sometimes too clear for fishing, but they run very, very clear. We have the opportunity to sight fish for fish. Even when we have an extremely heavy rain, runoff here, to back up a little bit, our runoff that happens, March or April, depending on what the weather conditions are, typically only lasts a day or two of unfishable water. We don't really have mountains, and as long as the ground isn't super frozen, most of that water percolates down into the groundwater systems and comes up as springs. So we have clear water year-round for the most part. After a couple of inches of heavy rain, it takes about 8 or 10 hours to get back to fishable water. The creeks clear out pretty quickly. So if you come up here for a trip and it's raining cats and dogs, the next day we can still put you on some fishable water and clear water. What also happens is it's a great opportunity to sight fish. If you move very slowly, they'll kind of treat your fishing as hunting. It'll be more of a blue heron walking on the banks than a stampeding cattle. You can actually spot fish feeding. Obviously, the ones on the surface that are rising are easy, but you can see fish in the bottom of the runs or the deep holes. Sometimes you can see those nice white fin tips of the brook trout that are feeding in the water because they stand out very well. So very, very clear water that enables you to sight fish. Another benefit of our fishery, if you wanted to, you have a shot at catching fish on dry flies all year long. Even a couple of days ago, if you have checked out our Instagram feed, we went out and just drove around to get out of the house and took a couple of videos. The air temperature was, I think, 20 below with wind chill, and we had fish rising to midges. Again, that constant water temperature and flow, it makes it easy for fish to be able to feed on those insects. And we have decent hatches and terrestrial fishing all season long. So if you're a dry fly junkie, you can sight fish for fish, you can head hunt for fish, watch for risers, and you can throw dries and have a chance at success all year long here in the driftless. The fish themselves, predominant species, brown trout, 98% wild population. What that means is they haven't stocked here in about 20 or 30 years. The small percentage that they do take, our State Department of Natural Resources actually shocks our creeks for a wild strain brown trout genetic to stock into other creeks. So the small 2% there are actually fish that have been shocked out of the driftless, and then a couple of sportsmen's clubs will buy them and raise them in spring ponds as opposed to the regular creek, and then they put them in at different points throughout the year. So it's like the fish went home, went off to college and came back home. Most of our fish are what we call hot dog size. It's a small stream, wild fishery. The fish live fairly high stress in that shallow water, clear, shallow water. But we do get bigger fish here. We don't necessarily expect them from year to year, but you can run into some significantly larger fish in the driftless. This fish here, my wife caught about 2 weeks ago when it was just over freezing out here, and we decided to take advantage of the sun and ran into a couple of nicer fish. The other major species we have here in our portion of the driftless are brook trout. And some of these are native genetics, and some of them, again, are wild genetics from the East Coast that were planted here 30 or 40 years ago. You're seeing more and more of those, as we probably all know, up in the headwater section of the creeks, the smaller, less fertile sections and colder sections too. However, because of the efforts of the DNR conservation organizations, and oddly enough, the last few massive floods that have rolled through our area, water levels gotten higher, it's opened up new spring heads, water temperatures dropped a little bit. We're seeing more and more brook trout over the past 2 or 3 years in spots that we hadn't seen them before. And even some of those can get a bit chunky too. Again, your normal wild brook trout, you're talking hot dog size at 8-10 incher, but we do get some bigger brook trout throughout the year. We also have the chance here of catching a wild tiger trout. You've probably seen some photos from Utah or a couple of the Canadian provinces that stock them, and they get really, really big. The tiger trout here are wild. They are incredibly rare. It took me, as the owner of the fly shop, 13 years to land a tiger trout. All the other guides, my wife, they're catching them in front of me, and it was a huge joke for a really long time, but very, very rare to catch these fish. I'd say it's actually more rare to catch a tiger trout than it is a trout over 20 inches in the driftless. So, the other benefit we have of this fishery is there's so much food. These are extremely fertile creeks. They're spring creeks. They have the aquatic vegetation. They have the sow bugs. They have the scuds, all of the other aquatic insects. Because there's so much food, is the trout aren't as competitive. When we read fly fishing books, we'll always know, your dominant trout's going to be here, and then downstream a little bit's going to be the secondary trout, and down from there will be the tertiary trout, those little graphs with all the trout behind rocks and stuff. The biggest switch, my wife and kids and I moved here from Taos, New Mexico, so I had the out west fishing brain. One of the biggest things that I had to get used to is trout will congregate and pod up here. They don't necessarily do dominant lie, secondary lie, tertiary lie. You'll go up to a pool or a run, and there will be 8, 10, 12, 24 fish in there, and they're all trout and they're all feeding. There's so much food that they don't have to establish that pecking order. One of the first things we did when we moved here is, driving around, taking a look at some creeks and whatnot, and poking my head over, and I'd spook a dozen or more fish out of there, and I go, oh man, these creeks are all full of suckers. It wasn't until I finally started fishing and realizing that, no, those are all trout. You can actually spend quite a bit of time if you're patient and meticulous. You can pull quite a few fish out of these smaller holes. Okay, bugs and hatches. This is something I'm not going to touch on too deeply. We can geek out on flies at the end of the speech, and I can do some stuff over email with you as well. It's predominantly a caddisfly fishery. We get some decent blue-winged olives in spring and fall. We get some good light-colored mayflies, your PMDs, your sulfurs, your Cahills, things of that nature, and really good terrestrial fishing too. Again, we can touch on bugs in more depth later on. We do have some non-traditional fly fishing food sources. If you were to fish only one fly in the driftless your entire life, a size 14 or 16 tan or gray scud should be it. I've talked to a couple of biologists that say that scuds are 80% of a driftless trout's diet throughout their lifetime period. So it's an extremely abundant and it's an extremely important food source for trout, and they're available all year long. They'll live in the springs. So when it's super, super hot out and the water temperatures are in the high 60s, the trout will put their nose in front of the springs. Not only are they getting oxygenated and air conditioned, so to speak, water, it's shooting scuds out of them as well. So scuds, very, very important. My favorite hatch in the driftless are crane flies. For those of you that have fished some of the spring creeks in Pennsylvania back east, it's similar fishing for the crane fly hatch in June. They're about a size 16 to size 18. They are creamsicle orange to a butter colored yellow. The cool thing about crane flies is it gives a good driftless teachable moment, which I'll touch on a little bit later, of moving your fly. Drag is not a bad thing here in the driftless. We also have an abundance of leeches here, most of them non-parasitic. You will get a couple stuck on your legs if you're not careful wet wading. Obviously no big deal, but it's a big food source for fish. If you want to catch some bigger fish, or if you want to just kind of take the census of a creek, throwing a leech pattern, just kind of swinging it through or stripping it fairly slowly is the way to go. Terrestrials, extremely important here. We've got farmland, we've got woodland, we've got tons and tons of places for ants, beetles, grasshoppers, crickets, and our creeks are so small that the fish can definitely pick on these terrestrials as they fall into the creek. They'll focus on them and chase them pretty heavily starting about May or so, sometimes earlier throughout the entire year. And then mice, again, cornfields, barnyards, houses, et cetera, et cetera. We've got a lot of mice in this area, and fishing mice at night can be an absolute blast on some of our creeks. The peak of season, when you should come and visit. The first peak of season is mid-April through mid-June. Typically mid-April, we get our first major hatch, the black caddis, and then into mid-June. The water temperatures will get a bit warm after that mid-June mark, not disastrously so. We just kind of change our calendar and fish early and late and avoid the midday heat. The second peak is mid-September to late September through that October 15th. Water temperatures drop, we see the reemergence of our blue-winged olive hatch, and the fish start to get a bit more aggressive as pre-spawn, quite frankly. So they'll chase some bigger meals as well as feed on the normal stuff. We tell people who fish the driftless to try to focus on that April to late May. This is what the bankside looks like that time of year. When you're in September and October, bankside vegetation, if it's not a grazed meadow, can be about 6 feet high, which makes it a little bit more difficult to fish as opposed to this nice, almost golf course looking grass there. So if you're going to visit the driftless for the first time, to make it easy on yourself, spring is probably the best time to do so. Again, we have good fishing and we have reliable hatches and water temperatures, but spring just makes it a bit easier. So fly pattern wise, when we think of our fishery, it's slower moving, crystal clear water, and the fish aren't as necessarily as anxious to go grab food because the water is flowing very slowly past them. When we're out west and we're fishing a big tailwater or a freestone stream, water tumbles by at a lot of cubic feet per second, or on the freestone streams, they could be rushing, rolling over the boulders and stuff. The fish kind of has to eat right away or it's going to die. Here, there's enough food passing by each day that the fish can be a little bit fussier and a bit more selective on what they eat here. Oh, that parachute Adams is passing by. I don't think I'm going to eat it. Second or third one comes through. No, I don't think I'm going to eat that one either. So a lot of our dry fly patterns is we'll fish hackle stacker style. Bob Quigley's hackle stackers, where the hackle's actually tied on top of the thorax. And what that does is the water line's roughly right here, so most of the body of this fly is actually in the surface film or just slightly below the surface film. Emerger-esque, but it really just gives a better silhouette on the water than your classic catskill, where it looks like a lion's mane tied around the fly, or even parachutes in some case. The same with this henwing caddis. It's that hackle stacker. The water line's right about there. This vast majority of the body is down below that water line. Leeches. We spoke on leeches a little bit before. Bunny leeches, mohair leeches, as long as it moves in kind of a ribbon-like fashion, it's excellent. We don't necessarily consider woolly buggers to be a good leech pattern because woolly buggers puff when they swim with the way that the hackle's tied, where a leech will actually flow and kind of undulate like a ribbon when it's in the water. Okay, this is a leap of faith. This abomination right here is called the pink squirrel. It was invented by a gentleman who lives just 8 miles up the road from us. Both of his sons guide for us now, who got sick of fish eating his pink indicators. So he started tying pink on everything and messing around with stuff. This goofy looking bug is probably the best fishing fly in the driftless area. We don't know what it actually imitates. Nobody knows. Even the inventor doesn't know. It's got 4 or 5 different blends of dubbing in here. You can see it's fox squirrel and some amber antron here. And then this goofy looking pink collar, and it's tied really thick. It's just food, but it's a very important bug for the driftless. Again, another caddisfly that's tied with clip tackle, so it rides real low in the surface film. Good example of a scud right here. This is your crane fly. And then this little foam guy is the hippie stomper. If you haven't heard of it before, it is an excellent terrestrial searching attractor pattern, whatever you want to call it. Fish in different sizes and different styles. You can tie a bit of tippet to the bend of the hook here, drop a bead head down below, kind of go hopper dropper. But even this, you can see the hackle's trimmed on it, so it rides a bit more flush in the surface film. So fly-wise, you want to make sure that they ride down in the surface film to give a bit more realistic presentation. They just end up catching more fish. Now to your terminal tackle. What we stress in the driftless is accuracy over distance and power. We're not casting 40, 50, 60 feet of fly line. We live in the 0 feet of fly line to about 20 or 30 feet of fly line tops. So something you're comfortable with fishing at a very close distance with the line to match. Sometimes your 9-foot 5-weight doesn't get that job done very well because it wasn't designed as a small creek rod. Typically anything in that 7.5 to 8.5 foot range, 3 to 5 weight, you'll be fine. There is no need for anything other than a floating fly line out here. If we're really ambitious, we can tie a mini 5-foot sink tip to throw some streamers, but for weight and things of that nature, brass bead or tungsten bead gets your fly right down to the bottom. Leader wise, We've had lots of friendly arguments with my guide staff and I about this. The way I tell people to prepare for the driftless is buy all 7.5 foot 4X leaders and carry 4 and 5 and maybe 6X tippet with you. I'm going to back up here a little bit because I just got done telling you that these fish are fairly spooky. They live in crystal clear water, but it hasn't been popular enough, nor has it gotten enough traffic, even in the years we've been here, that the fish are super duper leader shy. Yes, when you have a bright sunny sky and low clear water, then you might want to be pushing a 9-foot, maybe 6X leader on some of your flies, but we can get away with short, stout leaders. Our guys will even fish 7.5 foot 2X and tie a bit of 4X on for some of their flies. So the main thing to remember is keep it short so you can control it at a short distance. Polarized sunglasses should be a must for any fishing, but with the amount of sight fishing we do here, it becomes even more critical. A couple of extra dollars spent in your polarized sunglasses can actually make a world of difference in terms of overall fishing quality. Wading pants. Our creeks aren't super duper deep, so we're fishing a lot of pant waders. We have a lot of people who fish the old the hip wader style. We actually have a few people that'll just fish in fireman boots here. We're wearing waders from January through right about May or so, and then we actually start wet wading. When you come up here in summer, you want to make sure it's not necessarily for the bugs, but we do have wild parsnip in this area that you don't want to brush up against in the summer. Talking about bugs and biting insects, the same reason we have a terrible warm water fishery here means we don't really have that many mosquitoes here too. Moving from Taos, New Mexico to Viroqua, Wisconsin, I would get more mosquito bites in Taos, New Mexico than I do in Viroqua unless it's a super duper rainy year. Again, all that water's percolating in. There's no standing water for the mosquitoes to thrive in. So just a real quick touch on how we fish and where we're targeting fish. This is something we can have discussions in the shop. If you come out here and book a guide, obviously this will be reinforced quite a bit. The best way to describe the driftless is it's an easy fishery, meaning everything's set up for you: water temperature, water flow, pH, aquatic insects, accessibility, being able to walk up and down the creeks, et cetera, with sometimes difficult fishing. We have everything set up in our favor, but they're still spring creeks. The fish can be spooky. If it's a clear day, it can be very difficult. So The main thing is stealth is key. The more you can blend in, the slower you move, the fewer shadows you throw on the water, the better. This doesn't mean you have to crawl on your hands and knees or on your belly to approach the holes. Just walk slowly and wear some stuff that blends into the background. You know, even the picture of this angler right here, with a brown jacket and whatnot, is he might blend in a little bit, but could show up to the fish too. So as stealthy as you feel like getting and can get will give you a little better edge in terms of being able to catch fish. When we fish the driftless is 99% of the time we are fishing upstream. We'll stand downstream of our target, cast up, and let it drift back down towards us. In general, the fish are going to be focused upstream. They can see 360 degrees, but they're going to focus upstream on where their food source is coming from these little riffles right here. The sweet spot is right there, right where the riffle kind of peters out and it deepens. Avoid aquariums. Going back here, this right here is what we consider an aquarium. It's a very slow, flat, pool or run with no real structure to it. So there's no log, there's no rock. It's usually kind of sand filled. You will see a ton of fish in there. They're near impossible to catch. That flat water, the fish are incredibly spooky. You could have a 12-foot leader cast 60 feet, and once that leader touches the water, the fish spook. So really only under ideal conditions do we want to fish these little flats here. The ideal conditions being a slight stain on the water, a major hatch, or a very heavily cloud-covered sky. What we try to teach and try to focus on is fishing the letter S. If we see this as the letter S right here, we want to focus on fishing the bends of that letter S, the curves of that letter S, and ignore most of the straightaways here. What happens is, because these are meandering meadow streams, the water gains a bit of velocity right here. It starts to get a little bit deeper, and the water gets pushed up against the bank and kind of twirls like this and starts digging out underneath that bank. So you have this riffle, which is your main food supply. It also provides oxygen, and then you get a little bit of depth and cover right here. So a fish can sit right here all day long, not have to worry about overhead predators, and they can just kind of nose upstream and watch these bugs come right down into the little hotel there. So again, the S concept simply means we want to fish the contours of each little spot and avoid these straight, flat sections. Easiest thing to do, and I've been doing this for 30 years, if I go to a new fishery, I hire a guide, even if it's just for a half a day. We can learn a lot from the internet. We can learn a lot from going into fly shops or talking to people who have fished there. But to get your finger on the pulse, especially if you're going to be driving 7 hours, if you can do so, take even just a half day with one of our guides, and we'll kind of dial you in on how we're fishing, why we're fishing, and give you a better sense of the area. It's a little bit different than most fisheries out there just by the nature of it. So why the heck would you come here? You know, it's a long drive. It's Wisconsin. The driftless is something different. It's a different fishery. Yes, there are some spring creeks out east, the Pennsylvania stuff. Sometimes there you have to worry about private versus public. There might not be a lot of water. They can get overcrowded. That also leads right into the third point, is it's a little less crowded here too. So a different look, a different place. You know, you could say, hey, I caught a fish in Wisconsin, drive an hour and a half, say, hey, I caught a trout in Iowa, drive 45 minutes north, I caught a fish in Minnesota too, kind of check off your 50 state list. Again, we have fewer crowds here, excuse me, because of the amount of water we have and amount of public access that we have and angler-friendly laws. It's easy to find your own section of water pretty much any day out there. It's also on the way. If you've got a trip planned to Colorado, Montana, Wyoming, wherever it would be out west, we are 45 minutes south of I-90. So you can fish the driftless for a couple of days and then buzz west, or fish the driftless on the way back. We've actually had quite a few people that have been meaning to make their way out west, but they get stuck fishing our area for their entire vacation. Challenge yourself. Spring creeks can be very difficult. You can kind of up your trout fishing game and try out some new techniques. I had mentioned before, especially with the crane flies, in the driftless, drag is not always necessarily evil. we have that slow flowing water, we have that clear water, we have fish who are looking at the silhouettes of flies. They're still fish, they still have instinctual brains to them. So if they see 3 or 4 parachute atoms floating by them and they're not going to eat them, on that 5th cast, wiggle that fly, twitch that fly, kind of trigger their instinct that, hey, that thing's alive and I'm going to eat it. And before it gets away there. But insects themselves, aquatic insects, when they're hatching or even laying eggs, they're not stable. They don't stand on the water and drift perfectly, dead drift type deal. So sometimes that little twitch or that little movement is extremely important, especially here. Closer than you think. Again, it's not a 20, 30-hour drive to get out here. You don't necessarily have to hop on a plane, although there is a airport in La Crosse that you can fly into that American and Delta flies into. And then again, you're only 45 minutes away. It's also affordable. This isn't going out to Yellowstone. This isn't taking a trip out to Fernie, British Columbia. It's still small farm town here. So it's not going to put a huge dent in your pocketbook. So thank you. I appreciate it. We have, again, just to summarize, we have a fishery that's set up by Mother Nature, that we have great flow, we have great temperatures, we have great aquatic insects, which leads to really good, healthy, large populations of fish, and easily angler-friendly access laws. So it sets up to be an incredible fishery. All right, I'm going to stop my screen share here and get back to Zoom. I think we got it there. Okay, perfect. You should all be looking at me instead of the instead of the slideshow there. I'm sorry. Okay, perfect, wonderful. So at this point, I will leave it open to questions. We can either do them, we'll try to do them over Zoom here. You can type them in over on the side. And I know a couple of people have fished here. Good to see you, by the way. Yeah, go ahead.
I've got 2 questions. One is I think it's is it Cool Valley? After the floods, has that kind of recovered and gotten back? I know they had some pretty good flooding in that area.
Yes. In 2018, we had since our shop has been here now for 15 years, and in those 15 years, I think that was our 5th 1,000-year flood event. So it beat up that valley. On the West Fork of the Kickapoo, it actually busted. It broke a dam that was a flood control dam. So it did some major damage. The cool thing about this area being those big wide open meadows is it looks awful, and it's far more it did far more impact on farmland and houses and roads and things of that nature. The fish were back to normal feeding 3 or 4 days afterwards. So, they've been here a while. They kind of know what to do with floods. So it's actually really cool how quickly the fishery rebounds from what are fairly catastrophic events. So, the timber coulee system, which you were referring to, that's got 3 or 4 tributaries. It's fishing very well. Yep, if you had fished there before 2018 and you come back, it looks like an entirely different creek. But even over the past couple of years, we've seen it start to channelize and get back into its own stream bed and fishing very well.
Awesome. So what size leech pattern would you recommend? And is color olive, black, or what color would you recommend?
Sure. Yep. Typically just a simple size 8 to 10 leech. You can go a little bit bigger, a little bit smaller, but that 8 to 10 is the sweet spot. And it's 50-50 between black and like a natural gray. My wife started fishing natural gray leeches, 8 or 9 years ago, and I was super stubborn, saying, "Nah, black's the only leech that's worth fishing." But especially for whatever reason, for larger fish, I'm guessing they're picking it up as kind of a minnow pattern or a bait fish type thing. They really like that chinchilla gray, natural colored leech there. So black and gray would be my top 2. We've got this really funky thing that happens in about mid-April or so, the creek lamprey hatch. It's a non-parasitic lamprey that's native to our creeks, and they're burrowers and they're filter feeders. But when April comes along, they'll actually go up into the riffles and they'll put teacup-sized beds, and they'll stand on those beds and mate. But they're doing only that. You can actually walk up and pluck them with your hands there. So that's a really good time for big fish to have a really easy meal. And those would be more size 4 and size 6 and olive specifically. Those creek lampreys are olive. So again, black and gray kind of tied for the lead. Olive's the third color there.
Awesome. Got a couple questions in the chat. One, were grayling native to the driftless area back in the day, or just brook trout?
Grayling were outside of the driftless area's zone. Don't know why. I'd have to ask a biologist on that one, but I know that they weren't native here. It was all brook trout pre-colonial time here.
Awesome. And then I've got another question, and I was actually going to ask this too, but Bill asks, how did you get from New Mexico to the driftless area in Wisconsin?
We get that question a lot. So I was guiding and managing a fly shop down in Taos, New Mexico. My wife was down there when we met down there. I actually was born and raised in Michigan. And the guy that I grew up fishing with was from kind of east central Minnesota to begin with. So we'd always heard about the driftless area and the streams there, the Wisconsin Spring Creeks, et cetera, et cetera. He had fished them quite a bit. So when we had our second son and we were looking to move, a place that was, a bit more family friendly, New Mexico is awesome, but a better place to raise our kids is, I looked at her one day and said, hey, why don't we move to Wisconsin? And she was this close to punching me. What the hell would I want to move to Wisconsin? It might have been a little more flowery language than that, but then we took a look, and the scenery is awesome here. The fishing's awesome here. In Viroqua itself, the Driftless Cafe is the head chef at the little restaurant here, was third place for the James Beard Award last year. There's a regular grocery store. There's an organic food co-op. It's this really cool intermingling of everybody from all politics, all walks of life that get along here really well. So just a really cool community on top of being a fantastic fishery.
Awesome. Anybody else with questions?
Hey, Matt, Steve Haig, how you doing, man?
How are you, Steve?
Good. I just thought one tip the hard way when I got out there was, I think, is it May you got black flies?
Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you. Yes.
And there's one bottle of stuff you have to have because DEET doesn't work. You got to get a bottle of Buggins or you're dead in the water, literally.
Yep. Steve's fished here quite a bit, and as he pointed out, we do have gnats, biting gnats, buffalo gnats, and that's typically late spring into early summer. And as he said, the Buggins bug spray, it's their natural VMR, vanilla, mint, and rose. It is the only thing that'll keep gnats away. It works all over the world. It's a really good biting insect repellent. It's all natural, so it doesn't eat away at your skin, your gear, your fly line, whatever it may be. And you smell a little bit like a cookie when you use it too. So it's not offensive in any way, shape, or form. But yeah, the gnats can be pretty brutal here. But with a little bit of Buggins and keeping your skin covered, you'll be fine. But otherwise, if you don't use it, they will drive you insane.
Yeah, we were saved by some local anglers who we stumbled upon and said, "Hey, man, what are you guys doing about these bugs?" And they pulled out these Buggins, and we were back in action. Otherwise, we were going to head back to the car. It was pretty fierce.
Yep, I just noticed Tyler put the Buggins website on there. We carry it at the shop as well. And the guy who invented it's actually from Minnesota. So it's kind of a locally made, well, as much as a locally made pesticide can be, bug repellent can be, but he knows his stuff in terms of keeping those things off of you.
Yeah, and I've got the mosquito repellent too that I use here at home, and that stuff is legit. Everybody should go buy that stuff. Awesome. Any other questions from anybody?
My wife just said we can come down in early April.
Perfect.
So, lights on early April?
Yeah, early April is still good. The reason we don't necessarily put it in what we would advertise as the peak of season is the weather can still be a little bit wonky depending on how the winter goes. But typically late March into early April are spring blue-winged olives. Water temperature should be great. Flows should be good. We shouldn't necessarily have any kind of, again, quote unquote runoff. It's only a day or two. But early April is still a very good time to fish. The only time that we really talk people out of coming to fish, especially from long distances, is now. Just because you have to have the perfect day in the winter time with the right amount of sun and the right air temperature to get the bugs going and the fish going. But pretty much anywhere else from April through October, you're good to go. So Might just be a little bit chilly. You might get some snow melt in there, but the flip side of the coin is you could get that early spring blue-winged olive hatch, and about 2:30 every day have wolf packs of fish rising for you.
Awesome. Thank you.
Nice. One other question here from Jack is any recommendations on creeks for first or second timers coming up?
Yes, absolutely. In the shop, when you come in, grab a handful of bugs. We have a map. We'll highlight 6, 8, 10 of them for you. But just off the top of my head, the 2 marquee creeks, the ones that are best known for A, good fishing, but also B, very well marked public access, the Timber Coulee and the West Fork of the Kickapoo. But that's, again, 2 out of 65 in one county. So we've got tons and tons of them, and it kind of changes seasonally as well. So that's one of the things. Again, come on in the shop. We'll get you set up with whatever you need, and we've got a good map we're happy to highlight and point you in the right direction there.
What size are your blue-wing olives?
The spring olives, we fish them 16, 18, and then the later in the season fall olives are 18, 20s. But again, the driftless being the driftless and kind of a funky fishery, some of the best fishing we have in those blue-wing olive hatches are 12s and 14s, and twitch them. They're weird, but if all else fails, throwing a side of beef at them and wiggling it a little bit, we'll get them to go.
Awesome. Anybody else? Awesome. Well, I don't see anything else in the chat, and I don't hear anybody else chiming in. So, Matt, we appreciate you popping out. And as somebody who's been there, been in your shop, been up there and fished, it is an awesome place to go. Make sure you go up there and jump in and go fish up there. It's a spectacular place. And I'm with you. When I was thinking Wisconsin, I was not thinking these great, big, beautiful hills. And man, that's what it was. So I definitely encourage it, everybody.